Okay, let's talk about quadratic equations. So the word quadratic is when you have a variable that's squared, for instance, x squared, and of course an equation is when you're asked to solve. So here's an example. You're asked to solve for x squared plus 5x equals 6. Now you need to look for the word solve and you need to look for that x squared. And as soon as you have that x squared, that's when you know, okay, this is a quadratic equation. So let's talk about how do you solve a quadratic equation. Well, it's going to feel different because you're used to solving linear equations where you take the x to the one side and the numbers to the other side. But the very first step for a quadratic is to make the equation equal to 0, and that is really, really important. So please remember that, to take everything to one side and make it equal to 0. The second step is to ask, can I factorize? And of course, that can either be yes or no. Now, if you can factorize, let's look at an example, x squared plus x equals 12. So you spot that squared and you say, let's make it equal to 0. And then we're going to factorize. That's a trinomial, so maybe you need to brush up a little bit on your trinomial factorizing. And you get x minus 3 and x plus 4. So the answer here would be that x is equal to 3 or x is equal to negative 4. But you might be scratching your head a little bit and asking yourself, why? Where did that 3 come from? And where did that negative 4 come from? Well, think about if you take two numbers and times them together and get 0 as an answer. Now, you would know then that one of those numbers has to be 0. Not sure which one or both needs to be 0. So that means that you can split it across the times and you can say either this number or this other number is equal to 0. And this is such a nice idea that it's given a name. It's called the zero product law. So if we apply it to this one, that x minus 3, what value of x makes that 0? Well, a 3. And what value of x makes the x plus 4 0? And that's the negative 4. So let's just look at the mark allocations. One would be for the making it equal to 0, one for the factorizing, and then the third mark is allocated for that third step, the zero product law, where you splitting out across the times and you're saying that what must x be in order for the first bracket to be 0 or the second bracket to be 0. Okay, let's just take a little note over here that you don't have to do trinomial factorizing. For instance, if I gave you 6x squared minus 2x equals 0, that's not a trinomial, but it does have a highest common factor. So in this case, you would take out the 2x as a common factor and be left with a second bracket, 3x minus 1. Now to split it across the times, you can see that the times is between the 2x and the bracket. So either the 2x equals to 0 or the 3x minus 1 equals to 0. And that's how you get that x is equal to 0 or x is equal to 1 over 3 if you solve those two equations as linear equations. So there's your mark allocation and the steps next to it, making the 0, the factorizing the 0 product law. But now, what if you can't factorize? Well, in that case, you're going to use the quadratic formula. If you're in South Africa, this will be on the formula sheet. It's the formula negative b plus minus b squared minus 4ac all over 2a, where, of course, a and b and c are your coefficients of your quadratic equation. And so let's look at an example. 3x squared minus 2x minus 6. First of all, you can make it equal to 0. Then you can see your coefficients nicely. Your a is a 3, your b is negative 2, and your c is negative 6. You would then plug those numbers into the quadratic formula and use your calculator to solve for either the plus first and then the minus, or the other way around. Now, a few top tips over here. Well, first of all, if you look at the mark allocation, you'll see there's a mark for getting it to the standard form with a 0, but there's a second mark always allocated for that formula line with the actual numbers in the place of the B's and the A's and the C's. Now, you don't have to write it with the numbers. You could write it as the actual formula with A, B's, and C's, but I like to write it with the numbers because that's how I put it onto my calculator. I actually write that whole line on my calculator so that I can check it. And just with that in mind, if you are putting it onto your calculator like that, make sure to bracket the b squared like I did over there, because if it's a negative and you don't bracket it, your calculator will make it come out as a negative 4, which will be wrong because it's negative 2 times itself, which is a positive 2. So just be really careful when typing it onto your calculator. Again, I type the whole thing so that I can actually see it and I can use the little arrows on my calculator to go back and forth and check my work. And that's a good idea. And then make sure to put the little brackets in as well. Okay, let's finish off with just a little note on the different kinds of solutions that you could get. So sometimes you might get a 0 equals to a 0. So that means that x could be any real number. So you can just write that, any real number. If you get two numbers that are not the same, that means that there's something wrong with the equation and there's no real solution. And then finally, you could get an error on your calculator, and that also means no real solution. Of course, that would be with the ones that you can't factorize. Okay, so all of the best with quadratic equations, and please, if you enjoyed this video and found it useful, please send it to your friends and like and subscribe.